In the long and turbulent history of the Vietnam War, the battles remembered by the world tend to be the ones with dramatic scale, massive helicopter assaults, days-long sieges, legendary last stands. Yet among the hundreds of engagements that unfolded across the jungles, plantations, and villages of South Vietnam, there are smaller events, quiet, almost invisible at first glance, that left scars far deeper than their size would suggest. One such encounter took place in 1969 in the shadowy forests of Long Khanh province. It was not a clash of battalions, nor even a company-level fight. No artillery batteries fired, no waves of jets screamed overhead. The entire event lasted only a handful of minutes. And yet, for the Australian Special Air Service Regiment SASR, the most elite soldiers Australia had to offer this tiny battle became one of the most painful moments of the entire war. Today, it is remembered mostly by veterans and by the people who live near the site under a name both humble and haunting: the Battle of Liet Si, or the Tomb of the Three Martyrs. The title would come later, after the fighting ended, when the local community and local guerrillas buried the bodies of 3 Australian commandos with unexpected respect. But before the name, before the memorial, there was only a brief eruption of violence in the forest, a burst of gunfire that would devastate a highly trained recon team and shatter the illusion that elite Western special forces were untouchable in Vietnam. To understand why this small skirmish carried such weight, one must first understand who the SASR were in 1969. The Special Air Service Regiment represented the pinnacle of Australian military skill, meticulously selected, ruthlessly trained, experts in stealth, patrolling, long-range reconnaissance, and silent killing. Their motto, "Who Dares Wins," captured the spirit of a unit that prided itself on operating behind enemy lines, tracking guerrilla units, and striking with precision. In Australia and in allied militaries, they were considered a near-mythical force, invisible, lethal, and almost impossible to surprise. But Vietnam was unlike any battlefield they had encountered before. The jungles of Long Khanh were not simply trees and undergrowth. They were an ecosystem built for ambush. Thick bamboo thickets swallowed visibility. Footpaths twisted unpredictably. Fallen logs and bomb craters created natural firing positions. Every fragment of terrain had been studied, mapped, and used for years by local forces. For the Viet Cong guerrillas operating here, this was not just a battlefield, it was home. And so, when a small SASR Patrol entered this region during a seemingly routine reconnaissance mission, they carried with them not only their weapons and expertise, but also a quiet, deadly assumption that a handful of elite soldiers, moving with discipline and skill, could outmatch any local guerrilla force they encountered. It was an assumption that would be shattered in less than 2 minutes. For the local guerrillas of Long Khanh, mostly young men of the district force and village militias, this patch of forest was familiar ground. They knew every bend in the trail, every mound of soil that could serve as natural cover, every termite nest sturdy enough to deflect bullets. They did not possess the advanced training or equipment of the SASR, but they possessed something the Australians did not: deep, intuitive knowledge of the terrain and a network of villagers who reported the movement of foreign soldiers almost immediately. To the Australians, this mission was simply another patrol, part of the ongoing effort to disrupt Viet Cong operations in the area. To the guerrillas, it was an opportunity, a rare chance to strike at the very heart of Australian special operations. The stage was set not for a lengthy battle, nor for a heroic stand, but for an encounter that would unfold with shocking speed and brutal clarity. Within moments, the elite SASR Patrol would face a sudden ambush that they neither expected nor survived, and a tragic page of Australian military history would be written on the forest floor. To understand why the Battle of Liet Si unfolded the way it did, we must step into the world of Long Khanh in 1969, a world where the forest was not merely a backdrop to war, but an active participant, shaping every decision, every movement, every heartbeat. Long Khanh province, located northeast of Phuoc Tuy, was a dense patchwork of rubber plantations, bamboo thickets, termite mounds, bomb craters from years of airstrikes, an untouched jungle that could swallow sound and light in equal measure. Paths wound through the terrain like veins, some etched into the soil by decades of travel, others so faint they disappeared under morning mist. It was a landscape that punished even the smallest mistake and rewarded those who understood its hidden language. For the Viet Cong guerrillas of the region, members of district forces and village militias, this land was not merely familiar. It was intimate. They had grown up inside it. They had hunted, farmed, and hidden in it. During the war, they had walked its trails at night with no moonlight, navigated by memory and instinct. They knew which routes could trip a soldier, which shadows concealed clear firing lanes, and which stretches of path foreign troops preferred to patrol. The forest was both shield and sword. Their strength was not superior firepower or advanced training. Instead, it was the fusion of terrain mastery, local intelligence networks, and simple, devastatingly effective tactics. Every farmer, every child, every bicyclist on the road could become a lookout, relaying the presence of foreign patrols through whispers, hand signals, or a simple detour across a rice field. By the time a foreign special forces team stepped onto a trail, the guerrillas often knew exactly when they were coming. The Australian SASR, however, operated with a very different philosophy. Their mission profile relied on stealth, patience, and surgical precision. Moving in small patrols, usually 4 to 6 men, they crept deep into areas thought to host Viet Cong activity. Their goal was not to fight, but to observe, track, and radio intelligence back to their base. If they engaged, it was usually through ambushes of their own making or precise small-scale raids. On paper, the SASR were perfectly suited for counter-guerrilla warfare. Their training was harsh and unforgiving. Their discipline was absolute. Their movements were quiet enough that even seasoned American and Australian infantry sometimes never heard them pass. But in Long Khanh, that skill set came with a fatal vulnerability. Elite Western doctrine was built for unfamiliar terrain. The Viet Cong were fighting in their backyard. In 1969, guerrilla activity in the Long Khanh Phuoc Tuy border area was increasing. Reports suggested that local VC units, once scattered, were reorganizing. They were planting more mines, attacking road convoys, and slipping closer to Australian outposts. The forest seemed to be stirring again after months of relative quiet. Australian intelligence flagged a cluster of suspicious movements near a rural zone that villagers later referred to as the area of Liet Si, the future site of the battle. The SASR were tasked to investigate. Their mission was simple: insert quietly, patrol a series of trails known to connect VC supply lines, and determine whether enemy forces were preparing new camps. 6 men were selected for the patrol. They carried the compact weapons favored by special forces, CAR-15 carbines, M16 rifles, and silenced pistols. Their gear included claymore mines, medical kits, camouflage netting, and a powerful radio designed to call for extraction or supporting fire if necessary. They moved lightly, designed to survive off stealth, not brute force. But even before they stepped onto the trail, the balance of power was already shifting. Villagers had seen helicopters flying unusual routes. A farmer collecting firewood glimpsed dark figures moving through the rubber trees, figures moving with the wary posture of trained soldiers. Word traveled fast. Within hours, a local guerrilla squad knew an elite patrol was in the area. This guerrilla team was not a formal military unit. They were young men, some barely in their 20s, armed with one RPG-2 launcher, a few AK-47 seconds, and a single RPD light machine gun. What they lacked in experience, they made up for with home field advantage. Their squad leader understood exactly where foreign troops liked to walk and how they liked to approach bends in the trail. He had, in fact, watched the SASR Patrol's footsteps for nearly 30 minutes before ordering his men into ambush positions. To the Australians moving silently along the path, nothing seemed out of place. To the guerrillas lying only meters away, every sound, every footfall, every breath signaled an opportunity. The jungle was about to choose sides. The SASR Patrol moved through the Long Khanh forest with the silent confidence of men who had mastered their craft. Every footstep was deliberate. Every pause was calculated. The team leader, an experienced sergeant with multiple tours in Vietnam, observed the terrain with practiced calm. The trail was narrow but manageable, a faint path carved by villagers and guerrillas alike. To him, it appeared quiet, predictable, almost routine, but the jungle was whispering warnings, and the Australians, despite all their training, did not hear them clearly enough. It began with footprints, light, narrow tracks embedded in a patch of soft soil. The point man noticed them first. He knelt, traced the edges with a gloved hand, and whispered a report back down the line. The team leader examined them. The toes pointed south, away from their direction. The impressions were shallow, indicating a small person, barefoot or wearing thin sandals. Probably a young villager or a lone guerrilla scout. A single scout was not unusual. It did not change the mission. The patrol continued. Minutes later, they encountered a faint smell, an earthy blend of smoke and ash, the kind that lingers after a small cooking fire. It was faint enough to be mistaken for the remnants of a farmer's breakfast, but the SASR team knew that rural fires in Vietnam rarely burned without purpose. Still, there was no visible ash, no campsite, no broken branches. The forest floor looked untouched. The team leader made a judgment. Old site, nothing fresh. It was a reasonable conclusion, but a deadly one. For the guerrillas, these small traces were intentional. The VC squad had moved through earlier, using the same path but wiping away obvious signs as they went. Only faint hints were left, hints that could be interpreted as harmless, hints that lulled an elite patrol into believing they were alone. Deep in the trees, a young guerrilla fighter watched the Australians pass from behind a termite mound. He held his breath, memorizing their spacing and rhythm. When they were far enough, he slipped away with the soft, effortless movement of someone raised in the forest. A quick hand signal to his squad leader was all it took. The Australians were being tracked, tested, measured. Still unaware, the SASR Patrol moved steadily forward, their senses alert but their instincts slightly dulled by weeks of similar missions that ended without contact. Their standard formation, single file, spaced several meters apart, was perfect for stealth, but dangerously vulnerable to a flank attack. Their doctrine relied on seeing the enemy first, but in Long Khanh, the enemy was already watching from multiple directions. The first true warning came in the form of silence. Not the natural silence of the forest, but something sharper, thinner, a sudden absence of the usual insect hum. Veterans often describe this phenomenon as the jungle holding its breath. The point man noticed it. He froze, raised a closed fist to halt the patrol, and listened. Nothing. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves. But after 5 seconds with no clear threat, the moment passed. The silence felt like a trick of nerves, the kind of unease that came with heat and tension. "Move," the sergeant whispered. They continued. Meanwhile, the guerrilla squad was already in motion. Under the direction of their squad leader, they fanned out into a semicircle around the chosen ambush point, a shallow curve on the trail where 2 earthen ridges naturally pinched the path. It was a textbook kill zone, discovered and used by generations of fighters long before this war began. The RPG gunner took position behind a cluster of bamboo. He steadied the tube on his shoulder, exhaled slowly, and waited for the signal. 2 riflemen lay prone behind a fallen log, their firing arcs crossing the trail. The RPD machine gunner found a pocket of foliage that gave him a clear line of fire into the center of the Australian formation. The entire setup took less than 5 minutes. The Australians never saw any of it. As the SASR team approached the curve in the path, the team leader signaled for tighter formation. The vegetation grew denser here, visibility narrower. The air felt thick, heavy. One of the soldiers later described the moment as walking into a shadow that didn't belong in daylight. But by then, the patrol was already inside the kill zone. A soft bird call echoed from the bushes, too soft, too deliberate, but indistinguishable from nature unless one had grown up mimicking such signals. To the guerrillas, it was the command. To the Australians, it was just another forest sound. The trap was now set, and the jungle was holding its breath for the final moment. The SASR Patrol moved around the bend in the trail, unaware that every step carried them deeper into a bowl-shaped depression in the terrain, a natural amphitheater designed by the forest itself. The air was dense, almost suffocating. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin, trembling strands. Even the insects had gone silent, as if the jungle refused to betray what was about to come. Then it happened. A soft whistle, sharp, rising, unmistakably artificial, cut through the air. The bird call, the signal. In the same instant, the jungle exploded. A blinding flash burst from the right flank, followed by a thunderous crack that punched through the forest like a sledgehammer. The RPG rounds streaked toward the Australians in a plume of smoke, striking the point man with devastating precision. The top half of the trail vanished in a spray of dirt, bark, and shattered vegetation. 2 soldiers were thrown backward, their bodies limp before they hit the ground. The patrol's formation collapsed instantly. Before the shockwave even faded, An RPD light machine gun opened up from the left ridge, stitching bullets across the center of the Australian column. Green tracers carved bright, vicious lines through the foliage. The machine gunner fired in short, disciplined bursts, tap, 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 each volley chewing deeper into the kill zone. The SASR soldiers responded with the reflexes drilled into them by years of training. The second and third men in line dove off the trail, rolling into the underbrush as bullets snapped overhead. One returned fire blindly, firing 2 controlled shots toward the muzzle flashes, but the jungle swallowed his rounds without revealing a target. The team leader shouted an order, break right, but the command was drowned out by overlapping gunfire. He tried to raise the radio handset, but before he could speak, a burst from an AK-47 ripped into his chest. He collapsed onto the trail, the radio slipping from his fingers, crackling useless fragments of static. The patrol's radio operator sprinted toward him, desperate to retrieve the handset, but an RPG backblast sounded again, whump, and a second rocket screamed toward the trail. It detonated against a tree trunk with brutal force, spraying the operator with splinters and metal fragments. He fell without a sound, the radio crushed beneath him. Within 20 seconds of the ambush, the patrol had lost both communication and command. 2 soldiers remained in fighting condition, a rifleman and the medic. The rifleman crawled behind a rotting log, firing controlled bursts toward the machine gun's position. The medic dragged himself toward the wounded, ignoring the rounds snapping past his head, trying to apply pressure to a chest wound that was clearly fatal. But the guerrillas were not giving them time. The RPD shifted fire, sweeping low across the trail. The rifleman behind the log felt the rounds slam into the wood, showering him with splinters. He raised his weapon to return fire, but the force exploded again, as the AK team on the right flank unleashed another volley. A round struck him in the neck, and he fell sideways, limp. The medic saw him drop. He reached for his sidearm, his hand trembling, but before he could draw it, a burst of AK fire tore into the ground beside him. Instinctively, he pressed himself flat, clutching the wounded soldier beside him, trying to make both of their bodies as small as possible. The firefight was overwhelming, fast, and terrifyingly precise. Every guerrilla knew exactly where to shoot, exactly how to adjust fire, exactly when to pause. They had practiced this kind of ambush countless times, not on firing ranges, but in these very jungles. This was their terrain, their rhythm, their battlefield. For the SASR Patrol, the entire world had become a shrinking circle of smoke, blood, and noise. At the far end of the trail, the last man, a young trooper positioned near the rear, saw the destruction unfold in a blur of gunfire and screams. Without orders, he made the only decision that could save his life. He rolled off the trail and slid down a small embankment into a patch of ferns. The earth cushioned his fall. He pressed himself into the mud, barely daring to breathe as bullets hammered the trees above him. He lay still as death. Within 90 seconds, the shooting tapered off. Not because the Australians had repelled the attack, not because the guerrillas were retreating, but because there was no one left to shoot. 3 SASR soldiers were dead. 2 were critically wounded. Only 1 remained uninjured, and he dared not move. The jungle fell silent again, as if the gunfire had been nothing more than a brief, violent dream. But for the men who lay on the ground alive or dead, that 90 seconds would echo for the rest of their lives. For a moment after the last gunshot, the forest held its breath. Smoke from the RPG rounds clung to the trail in a hazy veil, drifting lazily between the trees. Leaves and ash settled like dust after a storm. The acrid smell of explosives mixed with the metallic scent of blood. It was as if the jungle itself had paused to acknowledge what had just happened. Then, faintly at first, movement returned. Not Australian movement, not the rustle of wounded men trying to rise, but the soft, synchronized footsteps of the guerrillas. They emerged from the foliage like shadows, breaking away from the trees, slow, cautious. Rifles raised not in triumph, but in practiced vigilance. Their faces were expressionless, hardened not by hatred, but by the simple, relentless calculus of survival. They moved with an eerie calm, stepping through the kill zone with the same precision they had shown in setting up the ambush. To them, the firefight was not personal. It was a task completed, a necessary strike, in a war fought village by village, trail by trail. The guerrilla squad leader scanned the battlefield. He identified the bodies quickly. 3 Australian soldiers lay motionless, sprawled at unnatural angles. Another 2 were still breathing, though barely, their uniforms dark with blood. He approached one of the wounded men, an SASR operator whose chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. The man's hand twitched toward his rifle, but his strength was gone. One of the guerrillas raised his weapon. The squad leader shook his head. Long Khanh had murmured quietly, "No need." They were not here to execute the wounded, nor were they here to loot. Every second spent on the ground increased the risk of Australian reinforcements arriving, infantry companies, artillery fire, or worse, helicopter gunships. The VC forces in Long Khanh had learned long ago that the forest protected them only when they respected its rules. Strike fast. Confirm. Withdraw immediately. The guerrillas quickly collected what intelligence they could: a map, a few documents, and the broken radio that had been crushed under the operator's body. They checked the pockets of the dead only for identification and weapons that could compromise them. They ignored the rifles and equipment too heavy to carry, too risky to keep. Before leaving, they dragged the fallen Australians off the center of the trail. It was a quiet gesture, one not often mentioned in military reports. Even amid war, there was a respect for the dead, especially for those who had fought bravely. In this way, the guerrillas ensured the bodies would not be immediately trampled by patrols or animals. The squad leader gave one last signal, a low whistle. The unit disappeared into the forest. Within 30 seconds, they were gone. Not moving quickly, not running, but melting away with the same fluidity that had brought them to the ambush site. Their footsteps faded into the undergrowth, swallowed by a jungle that had already begun reclaiming the silence. For nearly half an hour, the battlefield remained still. The surviving SASR soldier, the one who had thrown himself into the ferns, did not move a muscle. His pulse hammered in his ears as he lay pressed into the mud, terrified that even a breath too loud might give him away. Every rustle of leaves felt like an enemy returning. Every distant crack of a branch sounded like the ambush starting anew. He dared not look at the trail. He dared not call for help. He counted seconds in his mind, clinging to consciousness through sheer will. Finally, the forest began to sound natural again. Birds returned, insects droned, the jungle exhaled. Only then did he raise his head. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. 3 of his teammates lying lifeless, 2 others bleeding out in the dirt. The trail, which had been so quiet only minutes earlier, was now a graveyard marked by shattered branches and the blackened scars of explosions. At 11:40 a.m., he activated his emergency beacon. 15 minutes later, the first Australian helicopter thundered overhead. The door gunner scanned the trees and shouted into the rotor wash, "Jesus Christ, what happened down there?" It was a question no one could answer, not fully, not then, not even years later. As rescue teams arrived, they gathered the surviving wounded and carried the fallen toward the landing zone. Medics worked frantically, stabilizing the injured, whispering reassurance, forcing themselves not to look too long at the bodies of men they had eaten breakfast with that same morning. And as the last helicopter lifted off, its rotors blowing debris across the forest floor, the jungle once again became quiet, holding in its shadows the story of a battle so brief, so silent, yet so devastating that it would haunt the SASR for decades. When the helicopters returned to the Australian base at Nui Dut, carrying the wounded and the bodies of the fallen SASR troopers, a heavy silence fell over the landing zone. Soldiers gathered instinctively, watching in stunned disbelief as stretchers were unloaded. Even before the medics finished their work, word began spreading across the base like a cold wind. SASR Patrol ambushed, 3 KIA, 2 critical. For most units, heavy casualties were an unfortunate reality of Vietnam, but for the SASR, this was almost unthinkable. The regiment had built its reputation on stealth, precision, and survival. They were the soldiers who slipped in and out of enemy territory unnoticed. They were hunters, not prey. A single SASR fatality was rare. 3 deaths in one mission felt like a seismic shock. Inside the operations center, officers pored over maps, radio logs, and mission plans. The questions came fast, urgent, accusatory. How could elite soldiers be caught by surprise? Why hadn't they detected the ambush? Where was the intelligence warning? Had the patrol made a critical mistake? The truth, however, was more painful than any single error. The SASR had underestimated the enemy. At first, some officers refused to accept that a group of local guerrillas district force fighters, not main force regulars, could have executed such a precise, devastating ambush. There must have been a larger VC unit. There had to be heavy weapons involved. They must have walked into a base area. But as reports from the rescue team came in, these theories collapsed. Spent casings showed only a handful of AK-47 seconds and an RPD. RPG fragments matched an RPG-2, not a more advanced launcher. Boot prints indicated a small squad, maybe 7 or 8 fighters. The ambush site itself revealed the uncomfortable truth. A small, lightly equipped guerrilla team had outmaneuvered the best soldiers Australia had. A board of inquiry was quickly formed. It examined the patrol route, the spacing of the team, the timing of movement, the decision to follow a predictable trail, the failure to detect subtle signs of VC presence. The findings were clear but difficult to accept. The SASR Patrol had taken a route frequently used by local VC. They assumed low-intensity guerrilla activity meant low-level threat or fatal misjudgment. Their formation was optimal for stealth, not for surviving an ambush. The jungle's silence, normally a warning, went unheeded. They lacked nearby support and communicated only through long-range radio. None of these mistakes were dramatic on their own. Together, they were deadly. For the SASR regiment, the loss of 3 men on a single mission cut deeper than any tactical critique. These were not just soldiers. They were brothers handpicked, highly bonded, trained to trust one another completely. The surviving member of the patrol, still shaken, was interviewed repeatedly. Each time he described the ambush, he grew quieter. The scenes replayed like a film in his mind. The bird call signal, the flash of the RPG, the team leader collapsing, the radio dying, the helplessness of hearing his teammates' last moments. Many SASR operators later admitted that the incident changed the atmosphere inside the regiment. Confidence became caution. Caution sometimes became dread. The myth of invincibility had shattered. The Australian command issued new directives, some formal, some passed quietly among SASR patrol leaders. Never assume a district guerrilla is incapable of precision. Avoid using trails whenever possible. Increase spacing between troopers. Establish backup rally points every kilometer. Adopt zigzag movement patterns to disrupt ambush positioning. Conduct deeper listening halts in suspicious terrain. In effect, the regiment rewrote parts of its doctrine based on the lessons purchased with the lives of 3 men. Officially, the ambush was reported as a tragic but unavoidable loss. Privately, among SASR veterans, it became something else entirely. A humbling reminder that, in Vietnam, the fight was never fair and never predictable. One operator later said in an interview, "We thought we understood the jungle. But those young guerrillas? They were the jungle. It was not praise. It was respect, hard-earned and lifelong." In the grand scale of the Vietnam War, the ambush at More 3 Liet Si was tiny, 6 elite soldiers walking a forest trail, ambushed by a handful of local guerrillas. No villages burned, no large formations clashed, no map lines changed. Yet the impact of this brief encounter rippled far beyond the patch of jungle where it occurred. For the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, for the Viet Cong who fought them, and for the villagers who watched history unfold in their backyard, the battle left lessons and memories that would endure for decades. The ambush shattered one of the most deeply held assumptions of Western Special Forces, that elite training could overcome any enemy, anywhere. The SASR were extraordinary, soldiers tough, disciplined, and exceptionally skilled. But in Long Khanh, they faced an opponent with a different kind of strength, intimate, generational familiarity with the terrain. The guerrillas did not just know the jungle. They belonged to it. Every trail was a memory. Every mound and ditch had a story. Every shift in the jungle's silence meant something. Against this deep-rooted local knowledge, even elite foreign soldiers could be surprised, overwhelmed, and defeated. This realization forced a philosophical shift within the SASR and later within other Western militaries. Superiority in training does not guarantee superiority in context. Victory depends not only on skill, but on understanding the ground, the people, and the invisible rhythms of the battlefield. The ambush also revealed something Western forces often underestimated: the strength of the Viet Cong's human network. The VC squad that ambushed the patrol did not discover the Australians by accident. Villagers had reported unusual helicopter movements, spotted foreign soldiers passing through, and predicted the direction of travel. These reports moved through a decentralized web of farmers, woodcutters, and couriers long before the SASR realized they were being watched. This was a reminder of the core design of Vietnamese guerrilla warfare. Every civilian can be an observer. Every family can protect fighters. Every village is a node in a living intelligence network. For the SASR, this was an impossible structure to infiltrate. For the Viet Cong, it was the key to survival and success. The Vietnamese name for the site More 3 Liet Si did not refer to the Australians. It was named later when villagers buried 3 Vietnamese fighters who fell in a separate skirmish near the same area. But the name became linked in local memory with the Australian ambush. Villagers often told the story of how 3 Australian soldiers were buried respectfully before being repatriated. To them, the event symbolized an important principle in the Vietnamese ethos of warfare: fight fiercely, but honor the dead. Many Vietnamese accounts emphasize this duality: ferocity in combat, humanity afterward. This is why the story survived, even when official histories remained silent. Within the SASR, the ambush became a cautionary tale passed from one generation of operators to the next, not through formal ceremonies or official lectures, but through the whispered recollections of veterans. Recruits were told, do not underestimate local fighters. Do not trust silence in the jungle. Do not assume superior weapons guarantee survival. Do not walk trails. Ever. These lessons shaped SASR doctrine for decades. The ambush also influenced Australian public perception of the war. Although not widely reported at the time, later memoirs and oral histories revealed the emotional weight carried by survivors and comrades. Families of the fallen spoke about the lingering pain and the difficulty of understanding a war fought so far from home. For many veterans, the battle marked a turning point, a reminder that the Vietnam War was not simply a conflict of armies, but a struggle against an enemy who fought by different rules, on their own ground, with absolute resolve. In the end, the Battle of More 3 Liet Si stands as a powerful microcosm of the Vietnam War itself. A tiny, almost unnoticed engagement, a small guerrilla squad defeating a superior force, a clash of doctrine versus terrain, a reminder that technology cannot replace understanding, a lesson in humility, courage, and the brutal unpredictability of war. It showed that victory in Vietnam did not belong to the side with better equipment, louder firepower, or more polished training. It belonged to the side that understood the land, listened to its rhythms, and adapted completely to its demands. A battle of less than 2 minutes became a part of military memory for more than 50 years, not because of its size, but because of its truth. If you walk through the forests of Long Khanh today, nothing immediately reveals the violence that once erupted beneath those trees. The bamboo has grown tall again. Ferns cover the ground with soft green blankets. The air smells of damp earth, not gunpowder. Birds call to one another in the canopy above, unaware that their ancestors once fled at the roar of RPGs. The jungle, as it always does, has reclaimed its secrets. But for those who know where to look, the ghosts still linger. A faint depression in the soil marks where the trail once dipped into the ambush site. A fragment of rusted metal buried under roots might be the remains of a shattered rifle or an old M16 magazine. Villagers, when asked quietly, still remember what happened even if the war ended decades ago. They remember the gunfire that cracked through the forest like thunder. They remember the smoke rising above the tree line. They remember the sudden, eerie silence afterward. Some of them were the children who watched from huts and rice fields as Australian helicopters arrived to evacuate the wounded and collect the fallen. Others were the young men who, years later, placed incense at a small gravesite nearby 3 mounds of earth that would give the place its lasting name, More 3 Liet Si. In their eyes, the story of the ambush was not just a tale of victory or strategy. It was a reminder that every life lost in war carried weight, Vietnamese or Australian. The villagers who helped bury the bodies of the Australians before they were moved by Australian forces spoke of the moment with quiet respect. Regardless of uniform or nationality, a fallen soldier was a fallen soldier. War was brutal, but memory in Vietnam is rarely cruel. A reminder of war's most unforgiving truth. The Battle of More 3 Liet Si will never appear in international textbooks or grand documentaries. It was too small, too fast, too quiet. No generals planned it. No medals were awarded for it. In the official records, it is often summarized in a paragraph: 6-man patrol ambushed, 3 KIA, mission aborted. But this modest description hides a deeper truth. Sometimes, the smallest battles teach the largest lessons. This 90-second firefight revealed the fragility of even the most elite forces. It showed the immense power of local knowledge, human networks, and terrain mastery. It proved that no amount of training could fully prepare outsiders for a region where the Earth itself fought on the side of its native sons. In that sense, the ambush was not just a tactical victory for the Viet Cong, it was a symbolic moment that encapsulated the essence of the Vietnam War. The forest decides who survives. The locals know what the outsiders cannot. The smallest mistake can be fatal. And the war does not care about reputation, rank, or elite status. The human legacy. For the SASR, the ambush remains one of the most emotionally charged moments in their Vietnam history. Veterans still speak of the attack with a mixture of grief, humility, and respect even for those who fired upon them. They understand now what they perhaps did not fully understand in 1969, that bravery is universal, that war is impartial, and that the men who lay in wait for them were not faceless enemies, but sons of the same soil, fighting for their own reasons. For the Vietnamese guerrillas, the ambush was simply part of the endless struggle for survival, one successful action among thousands. Many of those fighters never lived long enough to grow old. Their names fade in local memory, yet their actions shaped the path of the war. For the villagers, the ambush became part of the land's story woven into the same fabric as the graves nearby, the trees that regrew, and the silence that returned once the helicopters left. What remains? Today, if you stand at the site where the ambush occurred, you may hear nothing but the rustling of leaves. But if you stay long enough, letting the forest settle around you, you may feel a subtle weight hanging in the air, an echo of the men who fought, fell, and disappeared into the soil. 3 Australians. 3 Vietnamese martyrs nearby. 2 nations' memories intertwined on a trail no wider than a doorway. A battle that lasted 90 seconds. A legacy that has lasted more than 50 years. In the quiet forest of Long Khanh, the war is long gone. But its lessons, its warnings, its sorrows, its moments of unexpected humanity are still alive in the shadows between the trees.